For this third part, I'll try to end at about 3:15 and get us on schedule. I think you will see a major shift between the style of thought in the second period and the style of thought in the third period. Because the style of thought in the second period, the sort of early cybernetics, was a kind of logical, analytical, sort of semi-mathematical approach. And the emphasis in this third period is going to be on neurophysiology and neurophysiological experiments. And so the style will be a little bit different. And then we'll talk about philosophical implications of this knowledge of neurophysiology. So this is what for a long time was called second-order cybernetics. You can think of it as biological cybernetics. It's an attempt to understand the functioning of the nervous system and then to think through the implications of the functioning of the nervous system for our understanding of knowledge, which should be related to knowledge management, and for our understanding of the nature of science. So these are some of the topics that I will cover. Cybernetics, second-order cybernetics had its origins in more fields than just neurophysiology, so I'll mention those. Okay, so just to remind you, these are some definitions. First-order cybernetics on the left and second-order cybernetics on the right. I showed you that earlier. Now, this is a walking through of that three-column table that I showed you at the end of the first period. First-order cybernetics was a realist view of epistemology. The idea was that knowledge could be a picture of reality, and you wanted to make sure the picture was in focus and sharp. So you were always testing a theory against observation. There was a distinction between reality and scientific theories, and you wanted to try to make those correspond as much as possible. This was an early philosophy of science. And the puzzle to be solved was to construct a theory which explained observable phenomena. What you wanted to explain was how the world worked. A key assumption was that natural processes can be explained by scientific theories, and an important consequence was that scientific knowledge can be used to modify natural processes. Second-order cybernetics had different views. The idea was that you had a biological view of how the brain functions and hints of the theory of knowledge. There was a distinction between realism and constructivism. Now let me explain what that means. Those are two different philosophical systems. Realism said that the external world is primary and theories are secondary. Theories are less perfect representations of an external reality. So that the reality is primary, the theory is secondary. Constructivism is just the reverse. Constructivism says that the theory is primary and the reality is secondary. Now, for those in the United States, they may say, how in the world could you come to a conclusion like that? Well, you have immediate access to the ideas in your mind. Okay, the ideas in your mind are there in your mind, so you have instantaneous access to them. The real world, on the other hand, is mediated by your senses, and your senses can be wrong, like you can see mirages or whatever. So the idea is that under the constructivist notion that the ideas are primary. This is also the notion of idealism. Ideas are primary, reality is secondary, because reality is only accessed through your senses, which can mislead you. So the puzzle to be solved is to include the observer within the domain of science under second-order cybernetics. What must be explained is how an individual constructs a reality. And we will go through a number of experiments to get across the idea of what I mean when I say the individual constructs a reality. The notion is that different people construct different realities. They have different images of the external world. A key assumption is that ideas about knowledge should be rooted in neurophysiology. That was the idea of experimental epistemology. And an important consequence is that if people accept constructivism, they will be more tolerant. This is extremely important. The people who created second-order cybernetics were, in most cases, the victims of political persecution. And they had, either under the Nazis in Europe or under Pinochet in Chile, they had a very visceral, personal experience with political ideologies and repressive political activities. And they had a very strong interest in creating more tolerant social systems. So, in a sense, second-order cybernetics is a program of social change. It is a scientific proof of the appropriateness of tolerance. I'll explain that later. Okay, what are the fields that contributed to second-order cybernetics? Or put it differently, what fields were drawn upon in the construction of the idea of second-order cybernetics? Well, certainly linguistics was part of it, because language is a limitation on what can be discussed. It's a limitation on how we can think about things if we don't have categories, and that knowledge progresses by inventing new words or inventing new meanings for old words. So linguistics was part of it. Mathematics was definitely part of it. Let me say a little bit about mathematics. We were talking about it at lunch. In science, you want a consistent, mathematically appropriate theories. There are two kinds of inconsistencies: contradictions and paradoxes. A contradiction is like A and not A. It is raining and it is not raining. That's a contradiction. A paradox is not quite as strong as a contradiction. A paradox is of the form, if you assume A and you run it through a logical argument, you end up with not A. Now, the most widely used example is the village barber. Imagine a town that consists of two kinds of men: those men who shave themselves and those who are shaved by the village barber. Now, the question is, who shaves the barber? If he shaves himself, then he's shaved by the barber. But if he's shaved by the barber, then he shaves himself. And Bertrand Russell, Whitehead and Russell realized when they were formulating the Principia Mathematica that if you formulate a set that contains itself, you will get a paradox. This has very tangible political implications in the form of the prevention of torture. In the United States Constitution, there is an amendment that says that you cannot be required to testify against yourself. If you can be compelled to testify against yourself, then you can be tortured. And usually the belief of the torturer is that if I torture you, then you'll tell me the truth. But if you're the person being tortured, generally you'll say anything just to get the person to stop torturing you. So the information obtained from torture tends to be highly unreliable because they'll just tell you anything. And ideally, as has happened in other cases, if, for example, during the Vietnam War, the United States had something called Project Phoenix. And my understanding is that you would capture one of the Viet Cong leaders and you'd torture him until he told you all of his colleagues. Well, pretty soon they discovered that the names they were getting were of their opponents. Okay, so in a sense, you were getting the names of the people who were supporting the Americans. And so then the Americans would go out and assassinate those people. And so the Americans were doing the work of the Viet Cong because the information they were getting was not what they thought they were getting. Well, this is a problem with torture and the collection of information. When you have a situation in which you do not know whether the information you're getting is an accurate description of the system or is a statement that you're making in order to advance your interests. If a person is talking about his situation, you have an inherent undecidability. You have an inherent inability to understand, to know whether you're getting an accurate statement or a self-advancing statement. So mathematics and self-reference were an issue in the artificial intelligence field because you would like to have an artificial intelligence device which can describe itself. Like my battery is running low, plug me in, or something like that. In order to have such a statement, you need to have a statement at a higher level. In other words, a statement that can monitor the state of the robot and its battery, say. But in order to have a description of that higher level, of how that higher level statement works, you need to have a yet higher level statement, and so pretty soon you end up with an infinitely large machine. But we have an existence proof that you don't need to have an infinitely large machine, namely the human brain. The human brain is able to refer to itself and talk about itself and not get stuck in these infinite loops of descriptions of descriptions of descriptions of descriptions. And it does that by making self-referential statements. But that is a kind of inconsistency. Now, this was known, has been known for 100 years or more, but it was a problem with the desire to create an artificial intelligence device or to create a logically consistent theory of social systems which was not subject to the biases of the people describing the social system. All right, so mathematics was part of it. Now, neurophysiology. The conclusion of the investigations in neurophysiology is that observations independent of the characteristics of the observer are not physically possible. Why is this important? Well, because an assumption of science has been that you could eliminate the observer. The goal of science has been to eliminate the observer, to get rid of bias, which I described to you earlier. So let's look at some examples in neurophysiology. There was a very famous Spanish neurophysiologist, Ramon y Cajal, who formulated something called the principle of undifferentiated encoding. The Spanish-speaking countries have always been leaders in neurophysiology for some reason. I'm not sure why. Going back to Ramon y Cajal, I guess. But Arturo Rosenbluth, Humberto Maturana, they're all from the Spanish-speaking world. Ramon y Cajal formulated something called the principle of undifferentiated encoding. And what that means is that what I perceive is not light or sound or touch or taste, but rather this much at this point on my body. This goes back to the notion that the only thing going on inside my head is Bips. In other words, after light passes the retina, there are only Bips. And after sound passes